Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, dwyervip.com. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Today is May the 22nd, 2017. First, apparently Floyd Mayweather met with Anthony Joshua, and according to reports, Joshua joked that he wanted to be on the undercard of the Mayweather versus Conor McGregor match. Now let me just say this as politely as possible. I don't care what's out there in the media. I know they're talking about Mayweather versus McGregor being a $100 million fight and stuff like that, right? Let's just be clear, and Anthony Joshua needs to get accustomed to this. If Anthony Joshua fights on the same card as Mayweather versus McGregor, Anthony Joshua would be the main event. Anthony, you're the heavyweight champion of the world. Right? I can't even envision a fight card where you have a guy who's the heavyweight champion of the world, right, with an unbeaten record, who has never gone the distance in his career, who just had a fight at Wembley before north of 80,000 people, who over-delivered on the pay-per-view, who would possibly be an undercard to some novelty fight where we already know the ending to. Right? The bottom line is, this story is a joke. I don't think McGregor and Mayweather can have Anthony Joshua on the card, because then the match becomes Anthony Joshua versus blank, and underneath in the small print, which is not what I believe UFC wants, would be Mayweather versus Conor McGregor. Right? Let me also say too, one of the people I subscribe to on Twitter is the Bronze Bomber, who himself is an unbeaten heavyweight champion with one of the biggest punches in boxing. Right? To the promoters out there, if you really want to guarantee big money for this Mayweather-McGregor match, if you really want to draw fans out who are actually serious about the sport of boxing, why not put Joshua against Wilder or Klitschko, the rematch? Right? Put that on the same card as McGregor and Mayweather, and watch the money then just roll in. Don't get me wrong, I'm one of those who, would be more interested in watching the heavyweight title fight. Remember what I like to say: there's the heavyweight champion, and then there's everyone else. Let me go further. People want to know who the biggest box office draw is right now in the sport of boxing. Folks, it's not Golovkin. Look at his pay-per-view numbers. It's not Canelo, right? Canelo just got 1 million pay-per-view buys in fighting Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. You and I know, when you have a real heavyweight champion, someone who the fans suspect might be real, like Anthony Joshua, 1 million pay-per-view buys is what? An off night in pay-per-view. I encourage you to look at what Lennox Lewis and Mike Tyson drew when those two guys fought. Right? The bottom line is, the biggest name in boxing right now from a box office perspective, and this has nothing to do with, who's the best fighter in the world pound for pound. That's a different conversation. If we're talking about box office, the number one draw globally right now is the man who just got over 80,000 fans into Wembley. Right? That's Anthony Joshua. His fight against Vladimir Klitschko, quite frankly, is the fight of the year. I can't even imagine a match, even the matches on the horizon that look promising. Right? Kovalev Ward, Canelo Golovkin, even those fights, I can't even imagine any of them matching the moment of a heavyweight title fight between a former longtime heavyweight champion and an unbeaten guy, both of them Olympic gold medalists, who had never gone the distance in a fight, who had won everything by knockout in front of a huge crowd at Wembley. No fight is going to touch that rarefied air, in my opinion, this year, unless there's a rematch between Joshua and Klitschko, or unless Joshua decides to fight Deontay Wilder after Klitschko says, hey, that's it for me, guys. I'm in my 40s. I have a kid. I have a babe I love. I see the exit, right? If that doesn't happen, right? Understand, I'm just telling you now, in May, the fight of the year would be Joshua Klitschko. Just food for thought. Let me segue to a different topic entirely. Right? Shannon Briggs. Wow, here's a shocker. Here's a shocker. Shannon Briggs in his mid-40s had an elevated testosterone count. He's failed a VADA test. Now, folks, these are not the 1970s when I was raised. Right? This is a different era where any of us can go online, can do a Google search, Shannon Briggs, can go back to when the guy was in his mid-20s, and can actually look at his body when he was in his prime, and then compare it to the guy's body today. Now, I'll agree, there have been advances in fitness. But when you look at Shannon Briggs' body, and when you compare his body to his body back in the day, right? I don't think you have to be Columbo. I don't think you have to be one of the world's great detectives to wonder whether or not the guy is juicing. Right? I mean, the bottom line too, let's be real here for a moment. The bottom line too is, if he's not juicing, then my God, what has he done? Found the fountain of youth? Found some food that elevates your testosterone, like, let's say, a performance-enhancing drug would, that nobody else has figured out? Let me also say this too, and I don't say it lightly, and for the record, I personally believe PEDs are rampant in sports, right? Not just boxing, but other sports. From time to time, some baseball player or some athlete gets busted for PEDs, and we look around and say, you gotta be kidding, right? Forget the fact that the guy's stats have gone parabolic, right? Forget the fact that when we look at the guy, he doesn't look like guys at our gym. He doesn't look like the neighbor you have who is in shape, jogger, right? Works out and stuff like that. No, these guys look superhuman. Right? They look superhuman. Well, what I want people to do is to just consider the fact that you actually had professional athletes. You had professional boxers in the 1970s. Guess what? Their videos are also up on YouTube. Some of those fights from the 70s, and I know that's prehistoric times to some of you, but some of those fights were actually filmed. They were actually on television, Wide World of Sports and other venues. They made it onto YouTube. Now, think about it. If the guys in the 70s were also professional athletes, fighting for the same titles guys are now, the heavyweight title, the middleweight title, the light heavyweight title, they all existed in the 1970s. Right? What I want people to do is to go back and look at those fighters and look at their bodies. Right? Understand, they're professional fighters. just like the people today. Many of those guys, just like the fighters today, were feeding their families, had financial responsibilities, had to pay mortgages, had to pay alimony and things like that. Right, just like the fighters today. So, when you go back to the 70s and you're looking at big guys like George Foreman, right? By the way, the guy's nickname was Big George Foreman, right? When you're looking at big guys from the 70s, and when you're looking at guys who were supposed to be, you know, muscular in the 70s, Kenny Norton, and then you look at guys today, and the guys look even more ripped, right? The guys look even more ripped. And you're looking at the tail of the tape. You know how at the weigh-in they tell you how much the guy weighs. You can punch in tail of the tape, the names of the fighters, and they'll give you things like height, reach, weight. And you're noticing that guys these days are routinely, and I mean routinely, weighing 250 and 260 for matches at heavyweight. Right, 250, 260. And then you realize that Joe Frazier, for the first Ali Frazier fight, didn't even weigh 210. Right, when you're looking at guys and they don't have an ounce of fat on them. And the guy looks just too ripped. And then you go back and say, wow, this guy in his 40s looks so ripped. Let me see how the guy looks in his late 20s. And you're looking at a video and the guy has more fat on him in his 20s than he does now in his 40s. You shouldn't be surprised when you hear that the guy has failed a PED test. You really shouldn't. Let me just say too, Shannon Briggs for a while was stalking David Haye. And David Haye actually looked at him and said, hey, let's see if you can pass a PED test. The fighters themselves know that certain guys are suspiciously in too good shape. Right? And so really, you know, none of us should be surprised. What I really hope that boxing does is, because the juicers are generations ahead of the testers, really what they should be doing is they should just say, look, if you're above a certain testosterone to epitestosterone ratio, right, we're going to note that if you fight for our title. Right? We're going to give your opponent an opportunity to decide whether or not he wants to be in the match with you. Because understand, the opponent has a family many times. Right? The opponent has loved ones. The opponent shouldn't be risking their career against some dude who might be on PEDs. You're not going to find drugs in people's systems unless guys get sloppy, because such is the state of designer drugs these days. Right? You're not going to find the drug. What you're going to find is the elevated testosterone. Right? The IBF, WBA, WBC, they need to update their way of thinking. Right? The idea should be simply, what's your testosterone ratio? If it passes a certain threshold, right, you're either ineligible for our title, or you can have the title with an asterisk, but we're not going to require, right, contenders who don't have that elevated testosterone ratio to actually fight you, right, lose their titles fighting you. Or, you know, we might have you fight for only certain titles that guys with elevated testosterone qualify for, whereas just like the WBA and all of these outfits have a super champion, then they have the WBA champion, right? They should have a, free-for-all champion, right? If you test with positive, a positive testosterone ratio, put that in the tail of the tape. So people can look and they see wins and losses, height, weight, testosterone ratio. Right? Educate the gamblers. If I'm about to place a bet and then I find out that some dude has 5 times the normal amount of testosterone in his system, you know what? If I was going to take the other guy, I might stop for a moment and say, you know what? Maybe my research on this fight isn't worth a darn, because this testosterone ratio has him in the ring with some dude who might be superhuman. Right? Let me just keep this money and spend it on things like food, water, and family. Right? We should know this. And let me just say, if a fighter feels that he's willing to risk it all, because boxing is assumption of risk, against some guy who, is juiced up, because let's face it, being juiced up doesn't guarantee you the win. Right? Then that opponent should have that opportunity. The point, though, is the information should be out there. Am I surprised by the Shannon Briggs positive test result? No, I'm not. Right? I don't have any insider information except my 2 eyes. I looked at old films of him. I saw a body that looked normal. Then I see him running around saying, "Let's go, champ," trying to track down Vladimir Klitschko, trying to track down David Haye, and his body just looked a bit too cut. Right? I'm an older guy too. Look at some of the gray here. Right? I see some dude in his mid-40s with Shannon Briggs' body. A body that looks better than it did in his 20s. And yeah, I'm gonna have questions, especially when Shannon Briggs is spending his time stalking people like Vladimir Klitschko. You wonder, wow, if he's stalking Klitschko and Klitschko is, hanging out wherever Klitschko hangs out, and presumably Shannon Briggs lives somewhere else, you have to say to yourself, wow, what time does this brother have to be in a gym if he's traveling the world trying to, taunt champions and major fighters? Right? If you yourself can't add the math together where you're like, wow, there are 24 hours in a day and this guy's away from home and this guy's traveling, and gee, to have this body would require a lot of work in the gym. Right? If the numbers don't add up to you, then none of us should be surprised when the guy ends up with a failed drug test. I'm curious to see how this plays out. I'm curious to see what Frez Oquendo does, right? Because, Frez might think to himself, I'm a pretty good defensive fighter. Shannon Briggs, stamina-wise, who knows these days, right? Because Shannon Briggs has been hanging out, beating guys in weakness protection, it seems, in the first, second, or third rounds, right? So maybe Oquendo says, hey, I'd rather fight Shannon Briggs than fight some real contender out here. You know what I mean? Some young guy doing it naturally out here who might actually be hungry. Right? Anyway, pay close attention to the Shannon Briggs story. Understand, those 2 guys were fighting for a title. The heavyweight division has splintered right now, title-wise. Right? Just know that VADA is claiming Shannon Briggs did not pass a drug test. Let me also say this too. Shannon Briggs is a diabetic. Now, I'm not a pharmacist. I don't know what Shannon Briggs' defense is going to be. It might be that he took some drugs for his physical condition in good faith, and that triggered whatever the trigger was on the test. Right? Just understand, though, whatever happens with Shannon Briggs, look around the rest of boxing. Right? This is a sport where Freddie Roach claims, and I won't name the fighter, he was looking, he asked to check the hand wraps on a very well-known fighter, right? Not his, the guy who, you know, his guy was fighting. And of course, they tried to play him. They said, hey, you know, he's already gotten his hands wrapped. We'd have to take off the glove for you to see the wrap. And Freddie said, well, take off the glove. Right? Because Freddie knows this scam, right? This is the same scam they tried to do with Nassim Richardson for one of Bernard Hopkins' fights, right? Hopkins was Richardson's fighter. Of course, they take off the glove and they find out that the guy has some sticky plaster of Paris type of substance on his glove. Now keep in mind, this is before Antonio Margarito gets busted. Right? Understand, boxing used to be so loosey-goosey that Freddie Roach tells the story, but fans didn't even know about the story at the time. Right? So then, of course, they rewrapped the guy's hands legitimately. Of course, the Antonio Margarito situation. He's busted with plaster of Paris on his hand wraps. That's the sport of boxing. That's where we are. Right? For young guys who think that this corruption is recent, go back, Google Panama Luis Resto, Billy Collins. Right? Just put those three names in a search and see what pops up. You're going to be horrified. Now understand, this is a sport where Tommy Morrison openly admits that he used to inject himself with steroids. But yet Morrison back in the day, and keep in mind, Tommy Morrison beat George Foreman. Tommy Morrison had a share of the heavyweight title at one point. In this sport where supposedly there are boxing commissions out there that know what they're doing, Tommy Morrison never tested positive. So the burden's really on us, the fans, to throw red flags, to grab red cups. I don't have one handy here, but to grab a red cup and to say, hey, you know what? This guy's body looks unnatural to me. Right? A lot of fighters right now are in the VADA program simply because the social pressure is such that they had to be in the VADA program. You can imagine, Shannon Briggs probably wasn't that enthusiastic about signing up for VADA. Right? Let's hope this trend continues. And just understand, years ago when Floyd Mayweather talked about requiring drug tests, you had several old-timers, Marvelous Marvin Hagler being one of them, coming out the woodwork and saying, come on, man, that's weak. You're just trying to dodge this fight. Guess what's happened since then? Several guys in very high-profile fights have been busted, haven't they? You've had heavyweight champions, Lucas Brown, stripped of their title for failed PED tests. Right? You've had guys like Alexander Povetkin have a title shot taken away from him for a failed PED test. Folks, this is at the top of the sport. Guys are getting busted. You could imagine in less regulated matches involving up-and-coming fighters how ridiculous the drug use is. Anyway, that's how I see it. Let me hear from you. I hope you leave your comments in the comment section to this video. Thanks for stopping by.